Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
Sometimes lawyers are accused of being picayune with the English language, every little word and every little comma. And the problem is, of course, that when attorneys are like that, it's because there's a reason for it. And once in a while, a story comes along that illustrates that magnificently. Stephen with a PH sent me a note, so Steve, check out the story. It's from Cafe Tech in English, and a simple comma is going to cost Apple billions in Europe, billions with a B. Starting June 23rd, Apple will no longer be allowed to collect fees on iOS external purchases in Europe. Jerome Marin wrote this. It's just a comma in a 66-page document, but that comma will cost Apple billions of euros in Europe. The Cupertino-based company will no longer be able to collect commissions on external transactions made from an iPhone or an iPad. In other words, all app developers will be able to redirect their users to a website to make purchase or subscribe to a service without paying Apple a single cent. The bombshell, which comes just after an unfavorable ruling in the U.S., is a result of a months-long battle over a comma with the European Commission. And that has to do with the Digital Markets Act, designed to strengthen competition in the digital space. In late April, Apple had already been fined 500 million euros. Now, the law was passed last year, and it bans so-called anti-steering practice, which Apple has enforced since the launch of the App Store. This required developers to use its payment platform and pay 15% or 30%. Officially, Apple has abandoned this, though Brussels still accuses it of maintaining technical and commercial restrictions. Apple has not given up on collecting commissions. It initially set them at 12% or 27% for purchases made within 7 days after redirection. It has since introduced a more complex system with fees up to 25% on transactions during the 12 months following installation or update of an app. According to the EU, these commissions not only go beyond what is strictly necessary, but they also violate the law. Now, the disagreement between Apple and Brussels centers on Article 5.4. Keep in mind that these rules exist in several languages, but in its English version, the article states that the gatekeeper, which is a term used by the Commissioner for the 7 major tech companies subject to the DMA, shall allow business users free of charge to communicate and promote offers, including under different conditions, and to conclude contracts with those end users. That long sentence has some ambiguity because does free of charge apply to everything or just part of it? Apple claims it only applies to communicate and promote, meaning the right to insert redirect links in an app, but not to conclude contracts, meaning making purchases. Based on that, Apple argues it can still charge commissions on those external transactions. Now, the European Commission interprets it differently. Contract conclusion must also be free of charge. It relies on the comma before the phrase, and to conclude contracts, turning the sentence into an enumeration. That free of charge applies to all that is being enumerated after. It explained in its detailed decision sent to Apple as part of a 500 million euro fine, which was made public last week. In other words, the price for app developers to pay for external purchases is zero, writes the Commission. However, its case could be weakened by inconsistencies in the French and German translations of the text, which it acknowledges are ambiguous. However, other linguistic versions leave no room for interpretation. And to complicate matters, the regulator acknowledges that Apple can be compensated for the initial acquisition of a customer by a developer, but this commission, whose rate must be determined by the company, can only apply within a limited initial time window after the first installation of an app. And it goes on from there, and there's a lot going on, and the idea of getting involved in laws being interpreted in Europe can become a real snooze fest. No offense to them, but this is an interesting thing to think about. And that is, I have drafted a contract before or an agreement that someone's going to sign. And I sit there and I look at it and go, have I covered everything? Did I leave anything out? Did I put everything in? You start looking at things like commas and periods and so on. And there are some basic rules of contract interpretation. I've talked about this before. Also, statutory construction, which is how you interpret statutes. And so there are rules that say if a statute's written this way, it's interpreted like this. If it's written the other way, it's interpreted like this. And when you stop and look at these rules, and you go, okay, most of them make complete sense, and most of them you can learn, and occasionally something slips through. And I vaguely remember doing a video a couple of years ago about somebody involved in a contract where they had put a comma that, if they hadn't put it there, would have changed the contract completely. And then, of course, one side wants it read one way, one side wants it read the other way. And, well, the comma's there, And so what's bizarre about this is that apparently this agreement is written in English, French, and German. And in English, they say, with the comma, there's no ambiguity. We know exactly what this says. And in French and German, apparently it's ambiguous. And so I am curious, and I assure you that somebody in my audience will know this, but the question is, if there is ambiguity in some translations but not others, do we go off the unambiguous translation? Or do we somehow try to resolve the ambiguity in some other way? Or is one of the languages controlling? In other words, do they say, well, what really counts is the English, but the French and German are simply there to help us? I'm curious about that. And I don't know the answers to those things, but I suspect that they have a whole body of law built up on this, because I can't imagine it's the first time this has happened. And so there's an author named Douglas Hofstadter who wrote a book called Gödel, Escher, Bach years ago about the three people, Gödel, Escher, and Bach. And he's using those three people and what they did as an illustration of some of the issues that arise around how we understand or think about language and how we think about thought. And in fact, some people were actually talking about how important his work might become in some fields such as, artificial intelligence, as if that would ever become a thing. But the book came out decades ago. And I remember reading that book, and the guy raises all these fascinating points. And in fact, I met him at a book signing in Ann Arbor a while ago. I shook his hand, said hi, loved the book. But neither here nor there. But he pointed out some things, that there are problems with our language, in that language cannot always express everything perfectly, nor can it be translated directly into another language. And so I've mentioned before to the people who do my live streams on Sundays, a movie came out a couple years ago called Sisu. And it's a Finnish movie. I love the movie. But the word Sisu doesn't translate directly into English from Finnish. I know what it means, but I have a Finnish background. I grew up learning what the meaning was. And there are other words like that people go, well, it kind of means this, but not really. Or it's this with a connotation of that. And you realize that cultures can be so different that a word can have a meaning in that culture that we can't even really understand in our culture, whatever our culture might be. So it's a fascinating thing. But one of the mental exercises that Hofstadter did in his book is he took the poem Jabberwocky, and he pointed out that it's been translated into other languages. But you might recall that the poem Jabberwocky actually contains made-up words. And the made-up words seem to have meaning. When you're reading it, you know these words are nonsense, but they still somehow have meaning. How do you translate a made-up word from English into French so that it still has the sort of meaning that we can feel in English, but a French speaker would feel the same feeling in French? And it's an interesting question. And he asks a lot of these really interesting questions. And so that gets you back to this. If this agreement is in three languages and French and German are ambiguous, but the English is not. Do we automatically go with the English because it's unambiguous? Or is it the official language? Or what? I don't know. What they're saying right now is that Apple very well could lose billions of euros going forward in Europe and has already been fined 500 million. So it's an amazing story and an expensive comma, as they say. So Stephen of the PH, thank you. Jerome Marin wrote that for Cafe Tech in English. Simple comma is going to cost Apple billions in Europe. Questions or comments, put them below. Let's talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. The only difference between a good and a bad haircut is about 3 weeks.